Long before the gold rush, Dr. John Marsh saw the hills and valleys of this pristine land and envisioned an opportunity to create an agricultural paradise.
He purchased 40,000 acres here in East Contra Costa County in a Mexican land grant, built in adobe, and later an impressive stone house. Now, he began sending letters east, which described the rich farmland. Letters so inspirational that pioneers immediately began a westward migration that changed forever the course of American history.
And just who was this man who set in motion these extraordinary events? Marsh was a man proud of his New England heritage. He was born in Danvers, once called New Salem, the site of the infamous 17th century witch trials. Here on the family farm, Marsh grew to manhood. There he learned to trap and hunt and dreamed of the mysterious wilderness beyond the mountains. As a boy, John once told his mother that someday I will live on the other side of the Rockies. His peaceful New England woods unknowingly became a training ground for a life on the frontier. To truly understand Marsh, you have to understand a strong-willed New Englander, descended from generations of Puritan ministers. During his early life, Marsh suffered from frequent and terrible headaches. He also suffered from a fiery temper, and he never backed down if he felt he was in the right. Marsh hated the drudgery of farm life. He hoped to escape by studying for the ministry. Marsh immersed himself in the classics, learning Latin and Greek. He studied at several famous boarding schools and developed a love of literature that he never lost, even when living in the wildest regions of the far west. In 1819, it was finally time to leave for Harvard and begin a new life as a freshman in the class of 1823. But in his sophomore year, angered by a perceived injustice, John became a leader in a student rebellion. Expelled from Harvard for dropping cannonballs off the university building, John returned home in disgrace. Reinstated by Harvard President Kirkland in 1821, Marsh now threw himself into preparing for a career in medicine. In preparation for medical school, Marsh began taking anatomy courses, and he did some medical work with Dr. Dixwell in Boston. Upon graduation, Dr. Kirkland offered John the opportunity to teach at Fort St. Anthony, later named Fort Snelling, 1,000 miles from Boston and surrounded by the wilderness of the Northwest Territories. Marsh told his worried mother that in 2 years he would have saved enough money to return to Harvard and enter medical school. The pay was good, and for young Marsh the prospect of adventure exciting. Beyond the Appalachians lay freedom from family and New England mores. There were also opportunities for the daring to acquire vast wealth in furs and land. This was to be his home for the next 2 years. As John Marsh walked up the steep road from the river landing to the fort, he was entering a new world. This was a military world, a raw frontier post at the furthest edge of civilization, a world of Indians and fur traders. This boy, coming from civilized New England, had a lot to learn quickly. John was to live in Colonel Snelling's home. John slept upstairs and shared a small bedroom with 4 of the boys. John Marsh was the first schoolmaster in the Northwest Territories. It was in this school that John taught the officers' children. By all accounts, he was a tough disciplinarian, but was a good teacher. Beyond the fort's stone walls lay the wilderness, stretching some 2,000 miles to the Pacific. This was the frontier of John's boyhood dreams. These were Indian lands, filled with broad prairies and virgin forests, alive with deer, elk, and buffalo, fiercely defended by a proud people. Colonel Snelling soon put John to work in a more important job. John agreed to be the temporary Indian sub-agent for the Sioux, while Lawrence Tolliver, the official Indian agent, spent the winter in St. Louis. Marsh was a good linguist and soon was speaking the Sioux language fluently. John fell in love with the Sioux, who were also known as the Dakota, and in particular Marguerite Descoteaux, a beautiful, intelligent, half-French, half-Indian girl. John took Marguerite as his common-law wife. They immediately moved into the headquarters of the Indian Agency. John taught Marguerite to read and write, and together they wrote the first Sioux language dictionary. After the winter freeze-up, for months Fort Snelling was completely cut off from the world. On foot, John made a 600-mile round trip between the fort and Prairie du Chien, carrying the precious mail. Afterwards, he wrote his family that after tramping through the snowdrifts and living through the sub-zero nights, he had never felt healthier in his life. He had earned $40, a small sum today, but half a year's pay for the ordinary foot soldier. Unfortunately, John's famous temper had now gotten him in trouble again. Tolliver's younger brother had insulted and attacked John. Now frontier tough, John gave Tolliver's brother a severe beating. Tolliver filed charges against John with the War Department and became his frontier enemy. Colonel Snelling defended John to the War Department, but nevertheless John was out of a job. Lewis Cass was the governor of the Michigan Territory and an Indian commissioner. John impressed Cass with his knowledge of Indian affairs. After the 1825 Indian Conference at Prairie du Chien, John returned with Cass to Washington, D.C. to meet the President, John Quincy Adams, and Cass's friends in the War Department. And John Marsh saw his family for the last time. John Marsh was now the official Indian sub-agent for the Winnebagos. His new post was Prairie du Chien at Fort Crawford. Prairie du Chien was a tiny, French-speaking village and the center of the fur trade in the Northwest Territories. A Mississippi river town supplied by keel boats. It was here that Marguerite, alone, gave birth to Charles, while Marsh was visiting for the last time his family in Danvers. Once John Marsh returned to the frontier, Chief Redbird of the Winnebagos gave Marsh his first crisis. In 1827, Colonel Snelling withdrew the garrison from Fort Crawford. It was then that Chief Redbird led a war party into Prairie du Chien, attacking and scalping the Gagnier family. Until military help could arrive, Marsh organized a defense of Prairie du Chien. John took command of the deserted fort and armed every civilian that could fire a gun. Even the women, including Marguerite, shouldered muskets. But still, Marsh led only some 90 souls, defending an outpost surrounded by thousands of increasingly hostile Winnebagos. In the end, however, Marsh held the fort until the regular army arrived. Redbird surrendered, and the frontier waited in an uneasy calm for the next crisis. And a crisis there soon would be. Meanwhile, Marsh, as Indian sub-agent, struggled to keep the peace. At great personal risk, Marsh retrieved Gagnier's dried scalp from an Indian graveyard. Alone, John then rescued a kidnapped pregnant Sioux woman and her child from the camp of a Fox war chief. He removed white trespassers from Indian lands, but the frontier remained a powder keg, ready to explode. But at that moment, John Marsh was dismissed. Joseph Street, the new Indian agent, was jealous of Marsh as a potential competitor. Street was also upset that an educated white man and U.S. government representative would openly take an Indian woman for a wife. Street's complaints, both trivial and imaginary, to Indian Commissioner General Clark and John Eaton bore fruit. By June 1829, John was supporting Marguerite and little Charles as a storekeeper in Prairie du Chien, trading with the Indians. In the spring of 1830, Street asked representatives of the Sauk and Fox tribes to meet with him in Prairie du Chien. The Sioux, traditional enemies, ambushed the Fox party, then paraded through Prairie du Chien, waving bloody trophies. After this embarrassing debacle, Street attempted to blame Marsh and his Indian wife Marguerite for tipping off the Sioux. However, contemporaries of Marsh wrote at the time that everyone in Prairie du Chien knew of the approaching group of Sauk and Fox representatives. For a year, the frontier boiled with revenge killings. In 1831, Marsh finally moved his small family downstream to New Salem, Illinois, to escape the growing violence. There, Marguerite and little Charles met a young Abraham Lincoln and stayed with the Pantier family until a pregnant Marguerite, desperately homesick, abandoned Charles to the Pantiers and returned to Prairie du Chien alone and on foot, exhausted, but home at last. Marguerite and her newborn baby girl died in John's arms. Even before John Marsh had finished grieving for Marguerite, the U.S. government asked him for help. General Atkinson asked John to recruit Sioux warriors as allies in the fight against the Sacs under Chief Black Sparrowhawk, known today as Black Hawk. John and his friend Chief Warbashaw raised some 200 Sioux warriors. But John Marsh spent most of the war using his frontier skills, carrying military dispatches through the enemy-occupied wilderness. Chief Black Hawk was eventually trapped against the east bank of the Mississippi River. There his band of nearly 700 men, women, and children were slaughtered as they tried to cross the Mississippi for home. Only 150 souls survived the massacre. Sadly, the peace treaty was equally disastrous for the Indians. Again, the wild frontier moved westward, and John Marsh followed, seeking his fortune and his destiny. In late 1832, John sold his Prairie du Chien business and left for the center of the American fur trade, St. Louis, Missouri. From there, in the spring of 1833, John Marsh plunged into the vast Rocky Mountain wilderness. He and a party of other fur traders headed for the Great Green River Rendezvous in Wyoming to trade with Indians and mountain men for beaver pelts. The land has changed little since John Marsh's day. The rendezvous was an orgy of drinking, fighting, dancing, and trading for the lonely men who had survived yet another year against great odds. Successful, John became a merchant in Independence, Missouri, supplying the growing Mexican trade on the Santa Fe Trail. And it was here, long before California, that Marsh first met John Sutter and Colonel John Bartleson. After the financial panic of 1835 ruined John's business, Marsh determined to seek his fortune in the remote Mexican province of Alta California, promising 9-year-old Charles to send for him once he was established. John, riding his horse Cherokee, left Missouri, heading for Santa Fe and the famed land beyond the Rockies, California. John Marsh was famous on the Missouri frontier as one of the few well-educated frontiersmen. Charles Bent and John Marsh were friends. Charles Bent, of Bent's Old Fort fame, was one of the most powerful men on the American Southwest frontier. Shortly before John Marsh took the Santa Fe Trail to New Mexico, Charles Bent urged Washington to appoint Marsh the U.S. consul in Mexican California. But impatient to begin a new life, Marsh left for New Mexico before Washington could reply. After escaping from Comanche raiders, Marsh made his way to Santa Fe with a Mexican trading party. There he lived for 3 months, becoming friends with many of the local mountain men and learning Spanish. In preparation for the dangerous journey to the remote Mexican province of Alta California, fording the Colorado at the Gila Yuma crossing, Marsh entered California and reached the tiny village of Los Angeles in the fall of 1835. The Mexican political authorities quickly granted Marsh a license to practice medicine. He soon had a thriving practice, where he excelled at aiding in childbirth and the treatment of malaria and smallpox. In less than a year, John Marsh had earned $500 in cowhides, the currency of the day. Then Marsh made his way to Yerba Buena, today's San Francisco, seeking to buy cheap land on California's wild and dangerous northern frontier. For $500, Dr. Marsh bought the 40,000-acre Los Meganos ranch from Jose Noriega. It was a rancho surrounded by hostile Indians and plagued by murderous horse thieves. Los Meganos, on the western side of California's wild Central Valley, stretched from the San Joaquin River to the foothills of Mount Diablo. He bought Los Meganos in 1837, becoming the first American to settle in what is now Contra Costa County. Dr. Marsh also became the first European to live in the San Joaquin Valley, more than a year before John Sutter. Before actually buying Los Meganos, John Marsh and Noriega joined a band of adventurers investigating Alta California's poorly explored interior. They reached the headwaters of the Sacramento, probed the Sierra foothills, and saw the richness of the vast Central Valley. They discovered a land swarming with herds of pronghorn antelope, elk, mustangs, wild cattle, and grizzly bear. Dr. Marsh settled on Marsh Creek, then known as the Arroyo de los Papilones, after the Indians who lived there. Dr. Marsh befriended the Native American, treating their rampant malaria with quinine and immunizing them for smallpox. Marsh also fed the Indian village during times of scarcity with With Native American help, Marsh built a fortified adobe, complete with gun ports to fight off attackers. With help from the Indians, Marsh planted a vineyard and established orchards of plums, almonds, and pears. Marsh then planted the first grain crop in Contra Costa County, a field of barley. In the early years, Marsh and his Indian followers trapped the San Joaquin Delta for beaver and river otters. He also traded for furs with American mountain men and Hudson Bay Company trappers. Marsh stocked his rancho from medical fees paid in cattle. The first attack on Los Meganos occurred in 1838. Indian raiders from the Sierras stole all of Marsh's horses, destroyed his Harvard diploma, and deed to the rancho. But soon Marsh was writing letters home to American newspapers, describing the agricultural potential of California's great Central Valley, setting in motion the historic tide of American migration to the far west, and the beginning of his conflict with Mexican Governor Alvarado. In 1840, Governor Alvarado suddenly threw Marsh and over 100 other Americans into the prison at Monterey. Mountain man Isaac Graham was accused of plotting a rebellion by American settlers, and Marsh's published letters to the United States describing the wonders of California aroused the suspicion and displeasure of Mexican authorities. John Marsh was eventually released unharmed, but most of the others were badly beaten and shipped in shackles to Mexico. Soon afterwards, the Bartleson wagon train left Missouri for California, following Marsh's instructions to the way west. They arrived destitute and on foot at the Marsh Rancho on November 4th, 1841. These were the first immigrants to travel the California Trail. Soon thousands would follow. General Vallejo, Marsh's friend, issued temporary passports, and the settlers scattered to find new homes. On this first wagon train were John Bidwell, future rancher and politician, Charles Weber, future founder of Stockton, and Nancy Kelsey, first American woman to arrive in California. As the flow of American immigrants increased, Thomas Larkin, American consul, and John Marsh worked together to bring California peacefully into the Union. Over the years, California had descended into a state of near anarchy. In 1844, the Mexican government attempted to reassert its authority by appointing Manuel Micheltorena, the new governor, setting off a revolt by the native Californios in 1845. At the Battle of Cahuenga, Governor Micheltorena was defeated and expelled from California. John Marsh personally persuaded Americans on both sides to lay down their arms during the battle. Supporters of Micheltorena, Sutter and Bidwell, were captured and jailed by the rebel Californios, thereby earning for Marsh two bitter enemies. Soon after Marsh returned from the Battle of Cahuenga, Dr. Marsh and Captain Weber issued the famous call to arms for foreigners. The object was to prepare for the peaceful takeover of California. Events then began spinning out of control. Under the urging of Thomas Larkin, the American consul, Marsh wrote to his old friend and politician Lewis Cass, stressing the importance and value of California. Cass passed on Marsh's letter to an interested President Polk. It was then that Fremont, leading 60 riflemen and guided by Kit Carson, went on a rampage through Northern California, defying a Mexican authority. Fremont urged Marsh to join him. Although friends with both Fremont and Kit Carson, Marsh was horrified. His plans for a peaceful annexation of California were being destroyed before his eyes. In retaliation, Jose Castro, California's military commander, drew up plans to expel American settlers. Fremont then commandeered Sutter's Fort, and on June 14, 1846, set in motion the Bear Flag Rebellion, an act of violence that John Marsh had worked so hard to avoid. The end of the Mexican-American War brought John Marsh new challenges and opportunities. During the 1848 gold rush, Marsh discovered gold on the Yuba River, a locality that quickly became known as Marsh's Diggings. Marsh used this wealth to build up his rancho. Soon, he was supplying beef and grain to San Francisco and the booming mining camps. But this lawless land swarmed with thieves, rustlers, and murderous bandits. At midnight on December 5, 1850, outlaws led by Claudio Feliz overran Marsh's rancho Los Meganos, murdering a young visitor after overpowering John and systematically looting the Marsh adobe. To fight the outlaws, Dr. Marsh now called upon his friend, James Kirker. Kirker, legendary gunfighter and scalp hunter, soon had the situation under control. But with the death of James Kirker in 1852 from natural causes, John Marsh was left to face the rising outlaw tide alone. As chairman of the county grand jury, Marsh angered many of the local rancheros. He tried to put a stop to the common practice of stealing Indian children and making them slaves on the large ranchos. In 1851, John married Abby Tuck, a Massachusetts schoolteacher. She had come to California for adventure and her health. Her letters to her family gave us the best description of what life was like on the Marsh Rancho and the wild California frontier during the early 1850s. The following is a story of life and death on the very edge of civilization, in Abby's own words.
September 14th, 1851. My dear family, where we live now is one of the most lonely places in the world. We have no church unless we go to town, which is not very often. We have had a very warm summer. One day the thermometer stood at 109 degrees. The mosquitoes bite me so bad. We live in the plainest possible manner and dress very plain. There is a house here, but not one that my husband wants me to live in. We live in an adobe house, which is rather old. The doctor now thinks of building a new stone house, which will probably cost from $15,000 to $20,000, and I long to see it done. In the spring, the hills and plains are one complete flower garden, and more beautiful than you ever saw. We have a very large vineyard. We are going to have a great many fruit trees, pears, apples, peaches, gooseberries, and currant bushes. August 29th, 1852. Since I last wrote to you, we have had a little daughter presented to us. Her father thinks she is the prettiest and smartest child in the world. We call her Alice Frances. The Indians who live on our rancho almost worship her. They think she is a perfect little beauty. As to your questions about the Indians, we are no more danger of being killed by them than you are. The bad and wild Indians are more than 100 miles from us. We have a great many Indians who live under the doctor's protection a few rods from our door. I think a great deal of them. Not a day passes but 2 or 3 or 6 Indian women come to see me. I often go see them and carry them medicines when they are sick. They now have the chills and fever. A great many of them would die if left to themselves. April 18th, 1853. Little more than 2 years or so, 4 men were hung for stealing the doctor's and another man's cattle. We have now less stolen every year. We have a great deal of money in a year, but it goes to hire helpers that protect us from thieves and vagabonds that surround us. Here the thieves and vagabonds are like wolves waiting to tear you in pieces if you do not keep a sharp lookout for them. October 5th, 1854. 3 murderers killed a man about 2 miles from our house. When they shot him, it was just dark, and he escaped to our house and lived 2 days and nights. He lived alone, and they supposed he had money. From the murdered man's descriptions, the doctor wrote to Stockton and had it telegraphed to San Francisco, and they were taken by the police and brought to Martinez. They are all convicted of murder and will be hung.
By the spring of 1855, Abby's health began to fail rapidly.
My dear family, I've got a kind and good husband who will ever take the best care of me. I do not know what ails me. I have no appetite, and I'm so weak. My dear parents and brother and sisters, my weak and trembling hand would fain clasp yours and say farewell. May God bless and console you. Pray for my dear husband and darling child who needs your sympathies.
Abby died shortly thereafter, in early August 1855. Dr. Marsh buried his beloved wife beside the stone house she had yearned for. Her last wish, to be buried by the side of my husband, would come to pass all too soon. The death of John's wife, Abby, in 1855, left Dr. Marsh devastated. John wrote shortly after Abby's death, "At present I am so overwhelmed with sorrow that I hardly know what to think or determine." But the new year of 1856 brought some comfort to John. John was finally reunited with his son Charles. a son who John believed had died many years before. And Abby's great stone house was finally completed in the summer of 1856. Now Dr. Marsh and Charles faced together the growing challenges to the survival of the Marsh Rancho. Bitter boundary disputes and the growing pressure from squatters and rustlers all threatened the ranch. It was late September 1856, and Dr. Marsh had urgent business in San Francisco. He climbed on his buckboard and alone began the 25-mile journey to Martinez and the steamer for San Francisco. On September 24, 1856, 3 bandits between Pacheco and Martinez murdered Dr. John Marsh. 2 of the killers were tracked down and brought to trial 10 years after the murder. The 3rd was never caught. A little more than a year after her death, Abby's wish was fulfilled. They now lie together, finally united in death as in life. For 30 years, Dr. John Marsh was among the courageous few who led the way west. He fought, lived, and loved on the wildest of the wild frontier. But, in the end, his real monument is not his stone house or even a state park, but California itself.